Hi, my name is Samah Shda, and this is my self-portrait. Hi. Hi. أهلا وسهلا. أهلا. It's really fun. Self-manipulated myself.
So I think what would be great is to start with your story. I'd love to hear a little bit more about your journey.
So I come from Baghdad. That's where I'm originally from. I grew up there during the 90s and early 2000s. And the first time I left Baghdad was in 2010 to go study abroad. I went to the United States for my bachelor's degree. And this was just, I think, 6 years after 2003, when the United States basically intervened, and there was the whole, like, the military intervention, the war, and it was very violent in my home city, in Baghdad. So studying abroad for me was a way to leave my city and go somewhere where I can be more safe, at least for 4 years. It was more of a pathway to safety than just like a scholarship or an education abroad. Then when I finished, I returned to Iraq and joined my family for a couple of years in the northern region, so that's Kurdistan. And that's where I started my work with humanitarian organizations that were working specifically on refugee protection and internally displaced people. So worked with very large-scale refugee camps and UN agencies that were tackling that issue. And that's where my career really in this field started. A couple years later, my family and I, we moved to Turkey, and that's where we applied for the Australian Humanitarian Settlement Program. And we ended up coming to Sydney in 2019, so that's about 6 years ago. And yeah, ever since then, I've continued my path of working with refugees and migrants, and that sort of that experience shaped the way I tell my story, what I do today. A lot of my interests and my career identity was built around that experience.
Wow, that's really inspiring. Amazing work. So what do you do today?
So I founded a business called Unbound Stories, which is a social impact startup that uses storytelling tools and creative design thinking to talk about inclusion and diversity, but in a way that is innovative, creative, that is led by people with lived experience, meaning people who have gone through displacement, who have migrated, who have been refugees, and who can sort of tell their story in a way that can transform policy, it can transform programs, it can transform organizational culture. So that's a big part of the methodology that we use.
What made you decide to do that specifically? It's specifically in helping people tell their story well.
Well, I mean, there's a long answer to this, which I can get into. I think storytelling is a very key aspect of the refugee journey. And if you think about it, a lot of people who seek refuge or seek asylum, there's a process of telling your story to the UN system or to the relevant body that you're applying for resettlement for, where you have to tell a story of being persecuted. And that story of persecution has to fit the refugee mandate definition. And that's really the sole focus of your storytelling. When you're introduced to telling your life story, that's how you tell it. And it's a very high risk way of being introduced to storytelling, because it's about survival. It's about getting to safety and saying the right things and framing events in the right way. And it's all based on the truth of what happened to you. But when you're telling it to a UN or a settlement officer, you have to focus on the part where you were a victim. So that's one way where I was introduced to storytelling very early on, before I even thought about starting this business. And what usually happens is that when you're waiting to be resettled or you're waiting for your refugee status, that story becomes your identity, because you're so afraid of messing with it. You don't want to take any part out, say the wrong words, be inconsistent, because that can all be grounds for you to be either, your status can be, you can be stripped from your safety of your status. And you want to make sure that you'll get to a destination country where you can permanently settle and no one will question you. So that story becomes the core aspect of your identity, and you focus on it so much. We've had to do that when my family and I were in Turkey for 3 years. We had to come up with a timeline of everything that has happened to us, and then really, really zoom in on a few events that made us seek asylum.
Was that for Turkey or for Australia?
So for Turkey, the way it usually works is that if you're applying for resettlement offshore, at least for Australia, this is how it works. You go to a first host country, which is normally called an asylum country. This is a country that is closer to you in terms of borders, so it's more accessible. You can run to it if you're fleeing risk. But normally, you cannot stay in it permanently. You're only there waiting to be resettled to a destination country. And that's where you can get a permanent status. So Turkey for us was the asylum country where we had a temporary refugee status, and the goal was to leave. And really, the system is made so that you don't have any permanent planning in that middle country. So you don't have access to medical services, you don't have access to education, you're not allowed to work. There's a lot of restriction that make it makes your life very temporary, and it's pretty much intentional. But when you go to the destination country, to go back to the storytelling, it's hard to leave that behind. While you're physically safe, and now, for example, in Australia, if you come in as a permanent humanitarian visa holder, you have access to all of the services. You have Medicare, you have Centrelink pensions, you have access to services, education, loan schemes, employment, settlement support, all of that. So technically you're okay, but then, how do you let go of what happened to your identity during transition and the story you adopted for your life? The story of survival, that I'm a victim.
Wow.
And so in my experience in Australia as an advocate, I got into storytelling in that way. I started working with refugee advocacy organizations. I started telling my life story to different platforms to educate people about what happens to refugees, which I still think is very important. But then I was introduced to another trope, another box, which is the hero journey, right? The idea that I'm supposed to tell a story of resilience, that I'm now this person who has survived and is in a better place, and I'm ready to give back. And it's a very sort of typical narrative that you might have actually seen in, like, if you're watching the news during Refugee Week, if you read like very reputable journal articles and news articles, it's the same story, the same narrative of this person is resilient, but not really going into how or why. So just some of these tropes, these boxes, were the inspiration behind why I wanted to create a model for storytelling that can promote real inclusion, not othering.
And I guess it makes a lot of sense, because if you look at media or even companies like marketing that they do, stories and spotlights on people, it's usually crafted in a way that's obviously serving their own story or agenda. And it's not always a bad thing, but probably it might disadvantage the person who's telling the story, or the story is being told. Is that right?
I think that it's, I mean, you're right that it's damaging to the person, but it's also damaging to the company. It's damaging to the story curator as well, because what you see is that audiences are not going to engage in a story that they've already seen.
So are you saying it's not authentic?
It's not authentic, it's not compelling, it's not nuanced. I'm not going to go and read a story about a refugee that is told exactly in the same way as all of the other stories that I've read, because part of me knows that's not the real story.
Yeah. So what is that story, and where does your compassionate storytelling framework come in?
What do you mean by what is that story? Do you mean
the story that's told and retold by, like typically told and retold?
Okay, so typically there's a model for a refugee story which you might be familiar with. I was in my home country, everything was fine. Then something happened. My life was at risk, so I fled. So there's the home country, there's the fleeing. Then there's the seeking asylum, which I've spoken about, where you wait in limbo in a first asylum country, so your life is temporary. And then there is reaching settlement, which is getting to your permanent place of country of settlement, your destination, really. And then the last one is advocacy or giving back. That's the normal sort of story arc for refugee stories. And the reason why it's told like that is because the goal is to give the audience a timeline of what happens, a very organized way of understanding someone's journey if it's too complex. So I'm going to give you dates and times, and it's very linear.
Right. Yep.
And it doesn't really go into nuances or the sort of the human behind that process.
So they end up all being the same?
They end up being the same.
Okay.
You have no idea how many hundreds of stories I've read, and I've been part of also writing and curating in the past, where it just felt like there was a formula for telling that story.
Okay. So do you want to tell us a little bit more about how do you help retell or reframe those stories to make them more, do I want to say empowering?
Yeah. So with Unbound Stories, we have the compassionate storytelling model. So that's a model that is based on 5 principles. And these principles are all storytelling principles. So they're not all originally mine or Unbound Stories creation. They're principles of what makes a story compelling. So all of the tools that you might be familiar with, story arcs, character maps or webs, like all the storytelling tools. But then with that, cultural safety principles are infused. So when I talk about cultural safety, it's a framework that was created in medical practice in New Zealand. And it was really a medical framework for engaging with the indigenous Maori population in New Zealand. And it was actually a nurses association that came up with this framework because there was a need for working with clients and patients who come from a different culture. And how do you make them feel safe enough to engage in clinical trials, in medical services, in seeking help? And so the framework was built to have very practical principles and indicators for how do you build a culturally safe environment in a hospital, for example. Now, so much research has been done on that, on cultural safety, and in fact, it's been being adopted in research ethics processes. So when you're working with any marginalized group, you now have to sort of look at cultural safety as an element that you might incorporate in, reaching out to your participants or making the research participatory. Now, to bring it back to the context of what I do, there are principles from cultural safety like strength, solidarity, safety, where you're asking the right questions to make the environment safe. So if we look at the compassionate storytelling model, one of the principles is, for example, authenticity. Now, authenticity is about truth-telling, and truth-telling is a culturally safe practice that has been used in indigenous advocacy and policy. And so the idea of that is to make sure that truth-telling is an aspect of how you tell a refugee story. And there are real practical ways to doing so. For example, the story needs to be told by the person who lived it. So lived experience is a big part of cultural safety. It's also what makes the story authentic. Truth-telling can be shocking sometimes, but it's also very necessary for audiences to feel the discomfort of, oh, I didn't know this. I came in here expecting a story to go in a certain way, but I'm actually now learning something new. And again, to go back to what makes a story compelling, that is a more compelling story. That is a less boring story for anyone in any audience, right? Because it has the element of intrigue, that you're teaching something new. And then on the other hand, the storyteller is feeling a bit more dignified, heard, seen. Their story is not silenced or molded into a specific frame that is more palatable for the audience. So that's sort of an example of how I bring cultural safety principles into the framework and then connect them to storytelling tools that makes the process more ethical. And it's very, very relevant to how we talk about inclusion and belonging in workplaces. It's relevant to working with refugee background students in universities. It's relevant to how we publish stories and tell stories about refuge and asylum seeking. There are so many ways where this is very relevant.
Yeah, I could definitely see a lot of places where this would be useful. I'm actually even thinking that even I can make use of it because, so as a non-refugee, I just mean, I feel like everyone can somehow make use of this framework because we all have some kind of vulnerability that we would like to share, but maybe are not sure how or are not comfortable.
Yeah.
So I can see a lot of value in that. And well, I guess relating it to my own story, I always find it, even though I work in storytelling, but it's a little bit different. It's visual storytelling. And when you're doing it for other people, it's a little bit more, it's a little bit easier, right? You're telling someone else's story.
It's actually a bit trickier, but yeah, but go on.
Well, I find that it's, I get energized by other people telling me their stories and creating with them the visual pieces that we do. But obviously that's under very, very different circumstances. When I am wanting to tell my story, it's a little bit uncomfortable because usually I'm thinking, why is someone else even interested in my story? So I feel like having the tools to be able to reflect back on why are you here and what's the purpose of telling your story is really valuable.
Yeah, and I mean, and your story does matter. I think it's just where you tell it and how you tell it and which part of it is relevant for what you're doing.
And why you're telling it, right?
Yes, yeah. And I get this reaction a lot from some audience members or even friends who haven't gone through the same refugee journey or something really tragic happening to them, that why would anyone care about my story, or why is it worth telling. And I actually think that's because they are exposed to that very narrow way of you know, this is an inspirational story arc, and this is how it's supposed to,
and they don't fit in that.
Exactly. So how can anyone fit into that? And a lot of refugees don't fit into that. That's the problem, is that you have celebrity refugees who speak as keynote speakers and share their story, and you see their faces on the news. And I was one of them, right? Like an ambassador. But at the same time, you have so many other untold stories, so many other people who don't want to fit into that story arc. It's either too scary, too much pressure, or it's too victimizing. They don't want to go into all the tragic details. So with this, there's another principle that we use in compassionate storytelling called connection. And that is more about finding the universal elements of your story. So again, universality is a very common storytelling tool. But in the context of this, it's very, very relevant, and it can have impact on, it's all about the audience and who's listening. Universality is about making the audience member or the listener think about their own story when they leave or after they've heard yours. So instead of focusing on you, you're actually inviting them to think about how do they tell their story, how does this feel relevant in their work, what can they bring with them. And the way I usually do that is when I introduce the idea that storytelling is a concept that moves and morphs in someone's journey when they're being displaced, I try to relate it to the idea that, for example, if you're telling a story to your colleague, and if you're telling a story to your mom, there will be two different versions of what happened.
Of the same story.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we're doing this all of the time, that we're finding ways to make our story relevant to the audience member. We're not morphing the truth, but we're trying to tell it in a way that feels more interesting. And that happens in the refugee journey, but in a much more extreme high-risk way.
And as you were saying before, they have to, if they're talking to authorities and they're trying to specifically tell their story to come to Australia, for example,
yes,
it's from a certain lens that they're telling it.
Yeah, it's all about fitting into the refugee definition.
And I assume when they come here and they become ambassadors, for example, it's a slightly different lens as well.
It's like the other side of the same coin, right? Because you're telling the same story, but adding the inspirational aspect to it, right? Because people need a happy ending. You can't really leave them in the middle. So it's kind of the same process, but reversed. It's not really a new model.
So tell me a little bit about how do you do this in practice at Unbound Stories? So if a client comes to you, and who's the client? And also, what would you do to help them get there?
So I have a client that is a multimedia magazine that wanted to produce an issue on migration, forced migration. And so I worked with them in two ways. I worked with them in the sense that they needed to create policy and procedure for how do they hire contributors and storytellers with lived experience. So these are all storytellers from refugee and forcibly migrant backgrounds, right? How do we engage even? How do we initiate that contact in an ethical way? And that's more of the cultural safety frame than just the storytelling, right? Like the cultural safety is about making sure people are paid, making sure that the process of commissioning is very transparent, making sure that there's informed consent, that there's legal counsel when it comes to how a story is shared and what risk that might introduce to the storyteller. Wow. It's duty of care, like that, in other words. So there's that element with my client, which includes trainings on cultural safety, and building policy and building frameworks for how they might engage with their employees who are from refugee backgrounds or migrant backgrounds or new contributors. Now, the other aspect of my work is the storytelling process. So with this specific client, because it's a storytelling client and they do storytelling and it is for the purpose of activism and impact,
Yeah.
we worked together on making sure that the content is fighting those stereotypes and tropes and boxes that I've discussed earlier, the hero versus victim narrative. We made sure that the formats are diverse. So this is where arts-based formats and visual storytelling becomes really handy. When you tell a story visually, you don't need to always follow a linear format of telling a story. So in doing so, you're sort of freeing it from that timeline, right? And you're inviting people to sort of imagine something and feel something without having to tell them everything narratively or in words. Now, it's a very interesting way of telling a story, and I don't need to tell you why visual storytelling is very impactful, right? There are so many reasons. But in terms of cultural safety, it's very impactful because there's actually research that shows arts-based formats like visual mapping is actually a much safer way of engaging with any marginalized group, any group that doesn't speak English as the first language, any group where you have to lean on trauma-informed methods, because it is a trauma-informed method. So there's a lot of visual storytelling that plays a role in creating a culturally safe environment for telling a story. And there's also, it also has so many different roles in, I mean, narrative psychology. Like, there's so many ways of using storytelling as a way to make impact, visual storytelling specifically. So I introduce that in my work with my clients as well. So most of the time when I'm assessing cultural safety, let's say I'm doing a narrative survey with a client, I combine that with a visual mapping workshop, because a narrative survey can tell me what is happening in the culture of the organization, and it's very narrative, but then the mapping can expose the emotional element and the other dimensions of the culture that people might not be comfortable sharing in a survey. So from a change management perspective or from an inclusion consultancy perspective, that's where visual thinking is actually used as a tool and part of the discovery and research process and analysis that is more in depth.
I love what you're saying, because we also see it in our work. And you know, any client we're working with, whenever we try, so we've got projects that we work on that are visualizing a company's culture and values, things like that, but also working on slightly deeper maybe challenges with the teams. And whenever we're running workshops, we do also obviously visual mapping exercises and even just visual activities to get a little bit more insight into how the team sees each other, their work, the organization. And actually, I thought of an interesting activity that we do where we get them to imagine the organization they're working for as an animal. And that sounds like just a fun exercise, but it really gives us an insight because it gets them to just imagine, and it feels less like there's less rules around it, so they can actually put a little bit more of how they see it, how they experience it. And
that's really interesting.
Yeah. And I feel like, every time we get people to sketch, even if they're not comfortable with it, they're just like, you know, they kind of lean into it.
Yes.
Actually. And it's much more insightful than if we're just asking them questions, because it feels like it's inhibiting. You know, I have to be careful with my words, but once I start sketching, the inhibitions are slightly lower, right?
Yeah, and I feel that it's also much, you know, based on what you're saying, it is a way to sort of check the pulse, because there's that emotional dimension of someone's visual map or visualization. that, it has to be current. It has to be sort of happening right now for you to express it in a certain way visually.
Yeah, that's interesting. I have lots of people saying, "Oh, it feels like a therapy session," when we get them to map it out, because they have to reflect a lot, and it's much different than just asking them to put keywords on post-its or something like that.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, that's really great. I actually wanted to ask you about how you use visual. Like, I love how you use visual storytelling to get people to tell their stories in different ways. How do you use visual storytelling or visual communication in your work? Like, is there, or in Unbound Stories, is there a place where visual storytelling has shown that it helps you communicate your own messages? I've seen an amazing video that you've created.
Yes, so the promotional video for Unbound Stories was a way to sort of explain why Unbound Stories exists.
Yeah.
And the idea behind it was to sort of show the process and the metaphor behind the work that I do. So I would say I'm a visual person. It's not something I'm trained in. I'm not like practiced in visual storytelling, but I like incorporating those aspects and working with creatives for that reason. So for the way we told like the origin or the why behind Unbound Stories, it was interesting to sort of think about the formats and give an example to the clients for what they might be working with.
I love that you used your own principles and how much you value visual storytelling in the way you communicate. That's why I wanted to bring it up, and I'll link to it in the video in the comments. But I think when you played that video at the meetup, it was very impactful. And if it was just the words, it probably would have needed a little bit of time to process. But the combination of your words and the images and the video that was put together, it really was. It left a very big emotional impact, I think, on people.
That's great. That was the goal. It's to really like showcase the pain points, because sometimes with businesses like Unbound Stories, it's really hard to explain what your service is because it's so tailored by the client. And I don't know if you have the same experience with shapeshifters, but
for sure.
But it is really, that's why it's a model. It's not a resource. It's something that cannot be generalized and used again and again in the same way. It has to be more of a lens that you put on and think about, because the world is changing. People's stories are different. The climate is changing, and what we're dealing with is very nuanced and different and complex. So it requires something more dynamic, something that can move through time and then really be a resource when it comes to building mechanisms, building frameworks, leaning on lived experience, being innovative, being creative. That's the idea behind it. And I mean, to connect it back to my own journey, I think when I first came to Australia, I struggled, for example, in terms of finding information about higher education. I wanted to continue my higher education here. I wanted to study my master's degree. And for, I think, a couple of years, I was just going from one information session to another, not understanding how the system works. I'm new in Australia. I don't know how the higher education system processes are. What are the admission requirements? How do you speak to people? I mean, even in terms of mannerisms, like, yes, I studied in the US before and I traveled, but I mean, Australia has a specific type of English. And what does that look like? How do you engage? Should you email? Should you contact person through someone else? All of these cultural stuff that no one really tells you about, no one teaches you. And I'm sure you can relate, 'cause
Yeah,
that's the
absolutely.
story of all migrants, right? Like
Yeah.
coming in, realizing, oh, this is just like the country I was in before, but slightly
But
different.
Yes.
Everything is
exactly.
slightly different.
Yeah, they should give you a handbook when you arrive.
Yes,
Yeah,
yeah.
just go through the whole thing.
Yeah. And it doesn't help that we have the opposite seasons of like the rest
Yes,
of the world.
the opposite everything, actually, I feel. Yeah.
But yeah, so that was the idea, is that I thought about what would it look like if I had a resource or an information booklet for me as a newly arrived person in Australia. But then I realized, well, my needs are different from someone else who, for example, doesn't speak English. My needs are different from someone who didn't travel. My needs are different from someone who's from a different gender, different background, different religion, all of that. So it's not more information that's needed. It's more of a way of knowing.
Yeah. Well, I think I'll go back to your what you said about visual communication being like it kind of transcends language, right? It makes things more accessible, and the idea that it's also emotional, that it makes you relate to it quicker. I think that's big, because you can find the common. I think you can find the common ground, but also it creates empathy in the person who's absorbing the information.
Yes, yeah. And there's actually a principle in the compassionate storytelling model called anti-fragility, which is it's a term coined by Nassim Taleb. And I think the most basic definition of it is that you grow stronger with adversity. So his whole definition of it is that we need to go beyond robustness or resilience.
Yep.
And think about what are the qualities and characteristics that develop uniquely in a person after they've gone through adversity or hardship. And in the context of he doesn't talk about refugees, just to be clear. But if you think about it in the context of a refugee story, you're introducing elements like uncertainty, hesitation, discomfort. All of these things, the more you experience them, the more you can adapt, and you can develop a comfort with uncertainty, for example. And that's an indicator for how anti-fragile you are, right? Being able to sort of develop something empowering, as you said, and not just inspirational.
Yeah. He's Lebanese.
He
right?
is Lebanese. That's right.
Was he basing it on the experience of the Lebanese people?
No,
or?
It was more of from an economics and
okay. Yeah.
like statistics perspective, and really, I think it was used more as a frame for assessing states and state economy,
Yeah.
whether it's fragile or anti-fragile.
Okay, yeah, because I was thinking of, I feel like that term is very appropriate for Lebanon, because there's always like, we're going into a very different topic right now, but there's always adversity happening,
Yes.
And there's always ups and downs.
Yeah.
And looking at it from the outside, living here,
Yeah.
and people, I'm actually going to Lebanon for Christmas, and people are like, "Oh, aren't you not supposed to travel there?" And and I'm like
it's my country.
My country. Also, my family is living there,
Yeah.
and they're at the beach at the moment, going to the beach. It's summer, so there's this kind of ability to be comfortable with uncertainty and just live through it.
Absolutely. And I mean, we have other names for it, right? We negotiate danger or navigate danger. If you're a local, you know where to go.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Like when you go
back
home.
I'm local. So
there are certain
I will know where to
neighborhoods.
go. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And there are dangers you can't avoid. But there are things, this is what I mean, is in my research with refugee background students in Uganda, this is where I was introduced to the concept of anti-fragility, because all of a sudden they were telling me about all these strategies and skills that they have for navigating a system, and Uganda is a big refugee hosting country with a very complex system and very like a small amount of resources for
Wow.
refugees. And so navigating bias, understanding how to dress, how to talk, where to go, who to speak to, how to broker knowledge, like how to be a peer mentor for your friends and your community, but also be connected to agencies, how to position yourself where you can get information first, how to say the right words when you're speaking with someone has prejudice against refugees. So it's all of these things. And I realized that there's no name for all of this amazing skill set that a person has to travel abroad, be stationed abroad to develop that amount of adaptability and social intelligence. Whereas with a refugee, someone who has gone through that transition, they kind of develop these skills already, and that's why they become anti-fragile.
Yeah.
It's very unique.
That's incredible. I can keep talking about this all day, but to wrap up the conversation, are there any tips for that you want to leave our audience with about storytelling, about how to tell their own story or someone else's story if they're doing that?
It's I think the element of making a story universal is really important. It's one of the things I discuss in the compassionate storytelling model, but I think that should sit at the sort of the forefront of how you engage with refugee stories or even migrant stories, because at the end of the day, you want to make it relevant and interesting for the people listening to it. If I tell you today, there are two stories that you could read. One is about a refugee who left 3 cats behind in Iraq, and then she went back to chase them. One is about a refugee who has gone through the UN system and applied for asylum and waited in Turkey and came to Australia. Which one would you want to know?
I would be interested in the cat thing, yes.
So both of these stories give you information and a glimpse into what a refugee journey looks like. But one of them is universal.
Yeah.
Because everyone can understand what it means to lose a pet, a family member, or leave a pet behind. And it is also this narrative of a quest, right? Like a journey, like this bravery. There are so many characteristics in this main character that are not portrayed in the other model.
And it's not that the other model is not important, or I mean, the other story or the process that they went through is not important, but it's the making it relevant, right?
Yeah.
As you said before,
it's making it relevant for the audience, but it's also, on the other side, as a storyteller, it's humanizing.
Yeah. It's probably a more personal experience.
Yes. Yeah. So that's the one that I would focus on. It's just making it universal. And that's the part where you can really make it compelling, but also be ethical.
Awesome. And if people want to find you online, connect with you, how would they do that?
They can go to my website, unboundstories.org, or follow us on LinkedIn, Facebook, and Instagram. Really self-limited.